Imagine every book you've ever read, every idea ever written down, burning at once. Not a single fire in a single library, but the collapse of human memory itself. Picture the heat, the smoke thick with ash and parchment. Somewhere in that blaze, the words of Euclid, Archimedes, Aristotle, and 1,000 names now unspoken vanish into air. What you're seeing is not a legend. It happened, and the place was Alexandria. 2,000 years ago, on the edge of the Egyptian delta, stood a city built for immortality. Its founder, Alexander the Great, never lived to see it finished, but his dream was clear. A city where East met West, where Greek, Persian, Egyptian, and Indian thought would meet in one crucible of empire. When he died, his general Ptolemy seized Egypt and made Alexandria his capital. And there, under a bright and merciless sun, they began building something the world had never seen. A library meant to hold all knowledge under heaven. They called it the Mausion, the Temple of the Muses. Part monastery, part university, part laboratory. Around it spread the Library of Alexandria, a network of halls, courtyards, scroll chambers, and lecture gardens. To enter its walls was to enter another dimension of human ambition. At its height, the library held hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Some say 400,000, others nearly 1,000,000. No one knows the exact number because no catalog survives. But imagine walking through its corridors, walls lined with cedar shelves, the air thick with the smell of papyrus. And ink, scholars murmuring in dozens of languages, Greek, Egyptian, Sanskrit, Hebrew. Every scroll, every fragment, every thought that could be captured was copied and stored. Ships that entered the harbor of Alexandria were searched by royal decree. Any book found on board was confiscated, copied by the library's scribes, and the copy returned to its owner. The original stayed in Alexandria. It was conquest through knowledge. Here, astronomy was mapped with mathematical precision. Physicians dissected human bodies to learn their mysteries. Mathematicians invented geometry as we still use it. Poets refined language until it glowed. For centuries, if you wanted to understand the world, you came to Alexandria. The librarians were not mere keepers of scrolls, they were high priests of reason. The chief librarian held a rank equal to that of the king's vizier. Scholars lived and worked in residence, supported by royal patronage, their meals and housing provided, their only duty to think. But ideas have enemies. Outside the marble colonnades, power shifted. Egypt was no longer the heart of Alexander's empire, but a jewel coveted by others, first by Rome, later by religion. And the library, that impossible dream of universal knowledge, stood in the crossfire between every ambition that followed. No one planned its death. There was no single night of flames, no neat ending written by history. The library died as all great things die, in stages, in fragments, each fire burning a little more of the soul. The first blow came with Julius Caesar. In 48 BC, cornered in the palace district during his Alexandrian campaign, Caesar ordered the ships in the harbor burned to prevent capture. The flames spread. They leapt from masts to warehouses, from warehouses to the docks, from docks to the city beyond. By morning, half of Alexandria's library district was ash. Caesar wrote of the victory. He did not mention the fire. Later, historians would say that tens of thousands of scrolls were lost that night. Entire histories, treatises, epics gone forever. The city was rebuilt, the library perhaps restored, but something was already missing. The dream of perfect preservation had cracked. Still, Alexandria endured. For centuries more, scholars came, copied, taught. But each generation inherited less than the one before. The scrolls grew brittle. The shelves thinned. The empire changed hands. Greek to Roman, pagan to Christian. Faith replaced curiosity as the ruling power. And through it all, the library's guardians tried to keep the flame alive. A quiet rebellion against forgetfulness. They copied what they could. They hid what they must. They whispered names like Aristarchus, Eratosthenes, Hypatia, the last of the great minds who still believed that reason could defend itself against the world. They were wrong. The final fire would come centuries later, when theology and empire collided one last time. But before we reach that night, we must understand what was truly lost. Not just books, but a way of thinking, a civilization's belief that knowledge itself was sacred. The Library of Alexandria was never only a building, it was humanity's mirror, proof that we once believed truth could be gathered, organized, and preserved forever. When it burned, that illusion burned with it. And in the silence that followed, the world forgot how much it once knew. It began not as a building, but as an idea. A dream whispered by conquerors and scholars alike, that the entire sum of human knowledge could be gathered in one place, protected from time and ignorance. A city of wisdom, built not with stone alone, but with thought. After Alexander the Great died in Babylon, his empire shattered. Generals carved it into pieces. But one of them, Ptolemy son of Lagos, took Egypt, and with it, the unfinished dream of his master. Ptolemy understood that power was not only measured in armies, but in memory. Whoever controlled knowledge could control the future. So he built a city worthy of the gods. Alexandria rose on the Mediterranean coast like a statement carved in marble. Wide avenues, shining temples, a great harbor guarded by the pharaoh's lighthouse, whose flame would one day be counted among the 7 wonders. And at its heart stood the Mausion, the temple of the Muses, the first university in human history. Within its colonnades, the Library of Alexandria began to take shape. It was no dusty archive. It was a living organism. Ptolemy Wyme and his son Ptolemy II sent agents across the known world, to Athens, to Babylon, to India, with orders to buy or copy every manuscript they could find. Philosophical treatises, astronomical records, medical texts, plays, poems, travel logs, dictionaries, all of it flowed into the city like tributaries feeding a single river. Every ship that entered Alexandria's harbor was searched. Scrolls found on board were seized, copied, and catalogued. The copies returned to the owners. The originals stayed in the library. The collection grew until the air itself seemed to hum with stored thought. Imagine standing inside it. Miles of scrolls stacked in wooden cubicles labeled by subject. Mathematics, philosophy, astronomy, law, medicine, geography, poetry. Scholars walked its marble corridors in white linen, murmuring lines from Homer as they studied Egyptian hieroglyphs or Babylonian star charts. Every discovery was cross-referenced, every observation written anew. It was the birth of research. The library's mission was not just to preserve knowledge, but to expand it. Scholars were paid by the king to live and work there. They ate in communal halls, debated under colonnades, and slept in chambers filled with papyrus dust. They dissected animals to study anatomy, traced the Earth's circumference with shadows, mapped the stars, and calculated the movement of the planets. Eratosthenes, the chief librarian, measured the Earth with astonishing precision, using nothing but geometry and sunlight. Aristarchus of Samos proposed that the Earth orbited the Sun, a thought so daring it would vanish for nearly 2,000 years. Euclid refined mathematics into logic. Archimedes, though based in Syracuse, exchanged letters with Alexandrian scholars, shaping physics before the word existed. Here, poetry and science lived side by side. Callimachus, another librarian, created the world's first library catalogue, 40 volumes long. He believed knowledge should be classified so that thought itself could be navigated. His work laid the foundation for every library that would follow. The library was more than Greek. Egypt contributed medicine, ritual, and astronomy. From Persia came philosophy and law. From India, texts on mathematics and medicine. From Africa, oral histories transcribed for the first time. Alexandria absorbed it all, translating everything into Greek, the universal language of empire. The Musion became a laboratory of translation and synthesis. When scholars could not agree, they debated until dawn. It was said that to live in Alexandria was to live in conversation with the dead, with every civilization that had ever existed. But knowledge has a price. It needs peace, and peace depends on politics. The Ptolemies who funded the library ruled as divine monarchs, half Greek, half Egyptian, worshipped like pharaohs, ruthless as conquerors. They understood that to maintain control over a diverse empire, they needed prestige. The library gave them that. It made Egypt not a provincial kingdom, but the center of the intellectual world. For a time, it worked. Scholars flocked from Athens and Rhodes, from Syria and Carthage, drawn by stipends and fame. Letters addressed simply to the scholar in Alexandria would find their way there. Knowledge became a kind of religion, its high priests, the librarians. But within that golden light, shadows gathered. Knowledge centralized becomes fragile. A single flame can destroy what took centuries to build. And the more the library grew, the more it depended on the will of kings who often saw scholars as servants rather than equals. Each new ruler changed the library's focus. Some prized philosophy, others astronomy, others flattery. Some built annexes, one near the Serapeum Temple, to store overflow. Each expansion increased its reach, but also its vulnerability. The library's wealth attracted envy. Rival kingdoms built their own centers. Pergamon in Asia Minor, with its new parchment scrolls, tried to challenge Alexandria's dominance. The competition grew so fierce that Ptolemy V reportedly banned the export of papyrus to Pergamon. Innovation answered with innovation. Pergamon perfected writing on animal skin. Parchment was born. Still, Alexandria remained supreme. Its scholars advised kings, mapped trade routes, and calculated taxes for the Nile. Knowledge became empire's engine. But it was also a threat to superstition, to authority, to those who preferred faith over fact. In the shadow of its greatness, whispers spread that the library was dangerous, that it questioned the gods, that it made men arrogant. And arrogance was the one sin the gods never forgave. When the Romans looked south toward Egypt, they saw not just wealth, but wisdom worth conquering. The Ptolemaic dynasty, weakened by intrigue and civil war, invited the storm. By the time Julius Caesar's fleet entered the harbor in 48 BC, Alexandria was both a treasure and a trap, a city too magnificent to survive the ambitions of men. Within its halls, scholars still read, still debated, but outside, armies were gathering. Fires were being prepared. The dream of Alexandria was about to meet the reality of the empire. The year was 48 BC. The city of Alexandria had stood for nearly 3 centuries, a beacon of civilization, philosophy, and science. Its marble streets gleamed under the Mediterranean sun. Its harbor overflowed with ships from every corner of the known world. Its libraries, its temples, its scholars, all were the pride of Egypt and the envy of empires. And into that world sailed Julius Caesar. He came not as a philosopher, but as a soldier. The Roman Republic was tearing itself apart in civil war. Pompey, Caesar's rival, had fled to Egypt seeking refuge. The young pharaoh Ptolemy VI, desperate to please Rome, murdered Pompey on the shore, presenting Caesar with his severed head as a gift. Caesar was not impressed. He had come to end a war, not to watch another begin. When he arrived in Alexandria and learned that the throne was contested between Ptolemy and his sister, Cleopatra, he did what Caesar always did. He intervened. The Romans seized the royal quarter, the most magnificent part of the city, where the palace, the museum, and the great library stood side by side. Outside, Egyptian forces loyal to Ptolemy gathered, cutting off Caesar's supplies and trapping him within the city. For weeks, the siege tightened. Food ran low. Arrows rained down from rooftops. The streets once filled with scholars, now filled with soldiers. Caesar's legionaries fought from behind toppled statues and broken columns. And then, desperate to hold the harbor, Caesar made a choice that would echo through history. He ordered the Egyptian fleet, moored along the docks of Alexandria, to be set ablaze. The fire would block the enemy's advance and secure the sea. The flames spread fast. The wooden ships, coated in pitch and oil, turned into floating pyres. The wind rose off the Mediterranean, carrying sparks into the city. The flames leapt from ship to warehouse, from warehouse to the nearby quarter, to the storehouses that held grain, papyrus, and scrolls. Soon, the fire reached the district of Bruchion, where the great library stood. No one knows exactly how much of the library burned that night. Ancient witnesses disagree, each writing from rumor and hindsight. But all agreed on one point. Something priceless was lost. The Greek historian Plutarch wrote later that the flames destroyed the great library. Others, like Strabo, suggested only a portion, perhaps the manuscript stored near the docks, had been consumed. The truth lies somewhere between the two, buried in ash. Imagine the scene. Scrolls stacked to the ceiling, each containing the labor of a lifetime. Histories of nations now forgotten. Medical treatises describing cures we will never rediscover. Plays, poems, maps, theorems, all written by hands long turned to dust. As the fire swept through the halls, the air itself must have glowed with the light of burning knowledge. The scholars who survived the siege wrote of it as if describing a funeral. They didn't mourn a building. They mourned memory itself. Caesar won the battle. Reinforcements arrived. Ptolemy drowned in the Nile while fleeing. Cleopatra took the throne and became Caesar's ally and lover. The war ended. The city rebuilt. But something inside Alexandria had changed. The library may have been repaired, perhaps partially restored, perhaps supplemented by the daughter collection housed in the Serapeum, the Temple of Serapis. But the damage went deeper than bricks and papyrus. The idea that knowledge could be eternal had been proven false. For centuries afterward, Alexandria's scholars worked to recover what they could. They copied from surviving texts, wrote new commentaries, and tried to reassemble what had been lost. But history does not repeat. It erodes. Cleopatra herself supported this fragile restoration. Under her rule, the museum reopened. Astronomers once again charted the heavens. Mathematicians refined geometry. The city glittered again, though dimmer now, like a flame after wind. But even Cleopatra could not protect Alexandria forever. Her alliance with Rome depended on Caesar. When he fell to daggers on the Ides of March, the balance shattered. The empire he dreamed of building turned on itself. Civil war returned, and this time, Egypt would not survive it. When Octavian, Caesar's heir, defeated Cleopatra and Mark Antony in 31 BC, Egypt became a Roman province. Rome inherited the library, the scholars, the culture, but not the soul. To the Romans, knowledge was useful, not sacred. Alexandria became one of many jewels in an empire that valued order over wonder. The museum continued under imperial patronage, but its purpose changed. The scholars who once chased universal truth now served imperial bureaucracy, charting taxes, drafting maps, preparing horoscopes. The library scrolls, once instruments of exploration, became tools of administration. And yet, through all the centuries that followed, the flame refused to die completely. Teachers like Ptolemy the astronomer and Galen the physician still walked the city's streets. Students from Greece, Syria, and Arabia still came to study the stars reflected in the waters of the harbor. The library endured in spirit, even if its shelves were fewer, its scrolls scattered. But the first burning left a wound that would never close. For what was lost was not merely information, but context, the continuity of understanding. The chain of human discovery had been broken. Ideas that might have changed history vanished before they could shape it. We will never know what lay in those scrolls. Perhaps treatises on machines long before their invention, mathematical proofs beyond our rediscovery, or histories of peoples whose names we no longer remember. The library's destruction is not just an archaeological tragedy, it is a philosophical one. The moment humanity learned that knowledge itself can die. And in that silence, superstition began to return. The empire that replaced the republic grew mighty, but not wise. The thinkers of Alexandria aged, their schools declining. One by one, the lights of the ancient world began to go out, Athens, Pergamon, Antioch. The last flame still flickered beside the Nile. But fires, once started, have a way of returning. The first burning was accidental. The next would be deliberate. The Library of Alexandria did not die in one night of flames. It died slowly, like a candle guttering in wind. A light extinguished not only by fire, but by faith. For centuries after Caesar's war, the city endured under Roman rule. The library's ashes were swept away. The museum's halls reopened. Scholars still worked there, though the scale had diminished. Knowledge continued, quieter now, under the watchful eyes of emperors. But the world around Alexandria was changing. Rome was no longer a republic of reason, but an empire of superstition and power. The gods of Greece faded into metaphor. The empire's citizens turned their faith elsewhere, to a new god from the deserts of Judea, and to a faith that promised certainty in a world exhausted by doubt. By the 3rd century AD, Christianity had begun its long, unstoppable ascent. To many of its followers, the wisdom of the old world was not sacred, but sinful. Pagan temples were places of deception. Philosophers were heretics. Books written by pagans were snares for the soul. And yet the old world did not surrender easily. In Alexandria, pagan scholars and Christian theologians argued in the streets, debated in the academies, and sometimes fought with stones and torches. The city that once united civilizations became the battlefield for a new war. A war not of armies, but of ideas. The museum still stood, but it was a shadow of what it had been. The scrolls had grown brittle. The scholars were fewer, their ranks thinned by neglect and fear. The great library, if any part of it still survived, was now housed in the Serapeum, a temple dedicated to Serapis, the god who fused Greek and Egyptian belief into one. It was there that the final spark of the old world flickered. The Serapeum was more than a temple. It was the last refuge of classical thought, a sanctuary where philosophy still spoke in the language of reason. Inside its walls, priests and scholars kept scrolls, conducted experiments, and debated astronomy and mathematics long after other cities had fallen silent. But outside, Alexandria seethed. In the year 391 AD, the Roman Emperor Theodosius IV declared Christianity the official faith of the empire. Paganism was outlawed, temples were closed, idols were smashed. The command was clear: the old gods must die. In Alexandria, the city of gods and books, the order was catastrophic. Crowds of newly zealous Christians, led by the patriarch Theophilus, stormed through the streets, toppling statues, burning shrines, tearing down altars. The Serapeum became the last stronghold of the old religion. Pagan philosophers, priests, and students barricaded themselves inside, clutching their scrolls as if they could still protect them. For days, the city trembled. The Christians surrounded the temple, chanting psalms. The pagans hurled stones from the roof. Imperial troops were sent to end the standoff. When they broke through the gates, the Serapeum fell, and with it, what remained of the library's soul. We do not know exactly what was destroyed that day. Some say the Serapeum's collection, perhaps tens of thousands of scrolls, was burned. Others say it had already been plundered long before. But the symbolism was undeniable. The last sanctuary of Greek learning had become a ruin. Theophilus ordered the temple's idols smashed. Statues of gods that had stood for 1,000 years were dragged through the streets and broken into dust. The great image of Serapis himself was shattered, his fragments scattered as trophies of triumph. For the Christians, it was victory. For history, it was silence. Yet even after the Serapeum fell, Alexandria still had one voice left, the last defender of reason in a world turning away from it. Her name was Hypatia. She was the daughter of Theon, a mathematician and astronomer who had once served at the museum. From him, she inherited not only knowledge, but conviction, the belief that truth must be pursued even when the world no longer wants it. Hypatia became a teacher, philosopher, and inventor. She lectured on Plato and Aristotle, taught geometry and astronomy, and drew students from across the Mediterranean. To them, she was not only a scholar, but a living bridge between worlds. the last flame of Greece still burning in Roman dusk. But fire attracts darkness. Alexandria in the 5th century was a city on the edge of hysteria. Christian factions fought each other in the streets. Paganism was outlawed, but not forgotten. And as mobs searched for enemies, Hypatia's fame made her a target. In 415 AD, a violent crowd, encouraged by the city's Christian bishop Cyril, cornered her as she rode through the streets in her chariot. They dragged her from her carriage, stripped her, and tore her apart with shards of pottery. Her body was burned, her school scattered. With her death, the last true scholar of the ancient library died too. It was not merely a murder. It was a message. Philosophy had no place in the new order. The age of inquiry had ended. The age of belief had begun. The flame of Alexandria went out, not with the crackle of fire, but with the whisper of prayer. The world that emerged afterward forgot what it had lost. The Dark Ages began not because knowledge had vanished entirely, but because it had ceased to matter. Books survived in monasteries, copied by hands that did not understand them. Equations and star charts became curiosities. The chain of learning snapped. The library's destruction was not a single tragedy. It was the slow surrender of a civilization, its confidence in reason. From the first fire under Caesar to the murder of Hypatia, nearly 5 centuries had passed. Each generation had inherited less, understood less, and questioned less. By the time the last scroll crumbled, the Library of Alexandria had already become a myth. But myths have power. They linger in the imagination long after the facts are gone. And in that persistence lies the paradox of Alexandria. The dream of gathering all knowledge ended in fire, yet its ashes seeded the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the modern world that would one day rebuild what it destroyed. For even in death, the library still whispers. Every book, every archive, every attempt to preserve truth, all of them are echoes of Alexandria, faint but enduring. The first fire consumed parchment, the second fire consumed philosophy, but the third, the fire of memory, has never gone out. When Hypatia's body turned to ash in the streets of Alexandria, the ancient world ended. Not all at once, not in the blaze of fire or the fall of an empire, but in the quiet after. The kind of quiet that settles when no one is left to ask questions. For nearly 1,000 years, that silence stretched. The great library was gone. The museum was gone. The scholars were gone. And with them went something far larger. The belief that truth could be discovered through reason alone. The city still stood, its harbor still busy, its people still loud. But the air had changed. The streets where Aristotle's heirs once debated now echoed with sermons. Temples became churches. The scrolls that had survived were forgotten, left to rot in storerooms or repurposed as kindling. The words of the ancients still existed, just unread, unvalued, unseen. The Romans who had once prided themselves on Greek learning now saw it as pagan decadence. The empire that ruled the world could no longer explain its own machines. In the centuries that followed, knowledge didn't disappear. It went underground. The wisdom of Alexandria, scattered and fragmented, drifted east with refugees and merchants. Some scrolls found sanctuary in Constantinople, the new Rome of the East. Others traveled south and east into Persia, where they would be translated into Syriac and then into Arabic. There, in cities like Baghdad, Basra, and Cordoba, the old words began to breathe again. In the 8th and 9th centuries, the Abbasid caliphs founded what they called the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. It was not a coincidence. The dream of Alexandria had found new life in Islam's golden age. Scholars like Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, Avicenna, and Al-Hazin read and reinterpreted the works of Aristotle, Euclid, Galen, and Ptolemy, names that had once filled Alexandria's halls. In their observatories and scriptoria, they preserved and expanded the fragments of Greek science that had survived the fall. They calculated the circumference of the earth, refined algebra, invented optics, and laid the foundations of medicine. They did not rebuild the library, but they rebuilt its spirit. It was through Arabic translation that the legacy of Alexandria survived the dark centuries of Europe, forgetting. Meanwhile, in the West, Europe slept. Empires rose and fell. Plagues burned through populations. Armies marched under crosses instead of eagles. The church guarded what knowledge it allowed to survive, copying scripture while science decayed into superstition. Monks copied ancient texts by hand, sometimes preserving them by accident, not understanding their content, but sensing their authority. The works of Aristotle, Archimedes, and Ptolemy survived in monasteries as relics of a pagan age, curiosities in a world that no longer had a place for them. For generations, no one remembered what had been lost. The Library of Alexandria became a legend told by candlelight, a warning about arrogance, a parable of divine punishment. It was said the gods destroyed it because men had tried to rival them in knowledge. It was easier to believe that story than to face the truth, that humanity had destroyed itself through neglect. Then, slowly, the silence began to break. By the 12th century, Europe was stirring again. Crusaders returning from the East brought with them more than relics. They brought ideas. Scholars in Toledo and Sicily, working alongside Arab and Jewish translators, rediscovered the lost works of antiquity. Aristotle returned to the West. Euclid's geometry reappeared. Galen's medicine was revived. The embers of Alexandria began to glow again, faint but real. Universities rose where monasteries once stood. Bologna, Paris, Oxford, each modeled, consciously or not, on the dream of the Mausian. The curriculum was built on the same pillars the Alexandrians had raised: philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and rhetoric. For the first time in 1,000 years, curiosity became a virtue again. By the 15th century, Europe was ready for a rebirth, a renaissance. When Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453, Greek scholars fled west carrying manuscripts, some of them direct descendants of the texts once housed in Alexandria. Among them were works of Plato, Herodotus, and Ptolemy. Their arrival in Italy was like oxygen meeting a spark. Printing presses multiplied what the scribes of Alexandria had once copied by hand. The ancient voices spoke again, louder this time, more democratic, less fragile. Painters studied anatomy as the Alexandrian physicians had done. Mathematicians revisited Euclid and surpassed him. Astronomers, reading fragments of Aristarchus, dared to suggest that the Earth orbited the Sun. The chain that had been broken was reforged. And yet, even as civilization reawakened, the shadow of Alexandria haunted it. Scholars could only guess what had truly been lost. They knew the ancients had reached heights still beyond them. They saw hints of vanished genius, references to treatises that no longer existed, names without works, works without authors. The Renaissance looked backward in wonder and forward in envy. Every discovery came with the ache of absence. Humanity had to climb again toward knowledge it had once already held. That is the cruel irony of progress. Civilization remembers enough to rebuild, but never enough to restore. The Library of Alexandria became a symbol of that paradox, the image of what happens when brilliance meets fragility, when the brightest minds build something too delicate for the age that follows. Even today, no one truly knows what the library contained. Its catalogue, Callimachus's Pinnaces, is gone. We have lists of names: Aristarchus, Eratosthenes, Hipparchus, Apollonius. But their works survive only in fragments, quoted by others who quoted others. It's like trying to study a civilization through echoes. But what mattered most about the library was not what it stored, but what it represented. The belief that knowledge could unite the world. That Egypt, Greece, Persia, India, and beyond could share a single conversation. That belief had burned. But its ashes fertilized everything that came after. Every modern library, every university, every archive is a descendant of Alexandria, born from its failure, defined by its loss. We build shelves and databases as if to defy time itself, forgetting that we are only repeating an ancient impulse to preserve what we fear to lose. But the lesson of Alexandria is humility. No matter how much we record, time always erases more. Knowledge survives not through permanence, but through transmission. Through those who care enough to copy, teach, translate, remember. And so the flame passed. From Egypt to Baghdad, from Baghdad to Cordoba, from Cordoba to Paris, from parchment to paper, from scroll to screen. Each age keeps the fire alive a little longer. The Library of Alexandria was gone, but its idea had escaped the fire. And ideas, once born, do not burn easily. Picture a single flame that refuses to die. It burns quietly, not in temples or palaces, but in the corners of human thought. The flame of Alexandria, the one that has followed us for 2,000 years. It flickers when we forget. It brightens when we remember. And though the library's walls are gone, its spirit has never left us. For centuries, the idea of Alexandria haunted civilization like a ghost. The dream of gathering all knowledge in one place, where humanity might understand itself completely. Every culture that came after tried to rebuild it in some form, as if history itself were compelled to finish what the ancients began. The Renaissance turned that longing into ambition. Men like Leonardo da Vinci and Copernicus read the fragments of lost genius that had survived the fires and decided to continue the work. Leonardo's notebooks were the papyrus scrolls of a new age, diagrams of the human body, blueprints for flight, maps of the imagination. Copernicus read the faint echo of Aristarchus and dared to say what the Alexandrians once whispered: "The earth moves around the sun." The fire spread again, into Galileo's telescope, Newton's laws, Descartes' logic. Each discovery was a spark struck from the same ember that once glowed beside the Nile. Humanity was remembering itself. When the Age of Enlightenment dawned, Europe built new temples for knowledge. Libraries rose beside universities. Collections of manuscripts multiplied like cells in a living mind. Scholars began to think of knowledge not as property, but as a public trust. In Paris, Denis Diderot began compiling the Encyclopédie, an audacious attempt to gather all human understanding into a single work. When he described his project, his words echoed Alexandria's founders almost word for word. To collect all the knowledge of the world so that future generations, more enlightened, might be happier. It was the library reborn in paper and ink. And in that rebirth lay the same tension that had destroyed the first one, the conflict between power and knowledge. The kings and priests who tolerated libraries as ornaments of prestige often feared them as engines of heresy. Books could start revolutions more easily than armies. But the idea had already escaped control. Printing presses multiplied like wildfire. Knowledge could no longer be burned, not entirely. Every copy destroyed was answered by a dozen more. The fire that once consumed Alexandria now existed in reverse, a fire of creation burning ignorance instead of parchment. By the 19th century, nations built great public libraries in conscious imitation of the myth. London, Paris, Boston, Cairo, each a shrine to memory. When scholars designed the British Museum Reading Room, they invoked the Mausion's circular dome, where knowledge seemed infinite and unbroken. The dream even reached back to Egypt. In 2002, on the same shore where the ancient library once stood, the Bibliotheca Alexandrina opened its doors, a modern resurrection of the old vision. Its architecture curves like the rising sun, its walls carved with letters from every language on earth. Inside, millions of volumes line the shelves, and on the facade is engraved a single phrase: Alexandria still speaks. But the truth is deeper. Alexandria never stopped speaking. Its voice is in every scientist who refuses to accept ignorance, in every teacher who opens a book, in every child who asks why. That is what the ancients built, not a monument, but a habit of mind. Still, the lesson of Alexandria remains as urgent as ever. For the same forces that destroyed the first library surround us still. The fire does not always come as flame. Sometimes it comes as apathy. Scrolls burn quietly now, in neglected archives, in languages that die with their last speakers, in servers that fail without backup. The empire that rules knowledge today is made not of marble, but of code. And code, too, is mortal. We live once again in a moment of illusion, believing that our information is permanent because it is digital. But permanence is an illusion. Hard drives corrode. Data disappears. Memory fades behind paywalls and algorithms. Every generation thinks it is immune to forgetting. Every generation is wrong. The ancient scholars of Alexandria knew that. That's why they copied everything. Why they built redundancy into the fragile architecture of memory. Why they believed knowledge should be shared freely, translated endlessly, given to anyone who could read. Because they understood the danger of concentration. That knowledge held in one place, one empire, one class, or one mind will always burn when the wind changes. Today, the wind changes faster than ever. In a single year, more information is created than in the first 5,000 years of civilization combined. But quantity is not wisdom. We have built the library again, larger, faster, infinite in scale. But we have not yet learned how to protect its soul. The fire that never died still burns both ways. It can illuminate, or it can consume. When the ancient library fell, humanity lost half of what it knew. When the modern one falters, we risk something worse, to know everything and understand nothing. The myth of Alexandria reminds us that knowledge is not accumulation. It is connection. The scrolls mattered because they spoke to one another. Philosophy to science, poetry to politics, art to astronomy. It was a web before there were webs. And when that network collapsed, understanding collapsed with it. We have rebuilt the web. Now we must learn to listen to it. The dream of Alexandria was never about preserving words on parchment. It was about preserving the ability to wonder. That is why it still matters. That is why its fire still burns. Even as wars erase cities, as floods drown archives, as regimes censor history, the flame finds new hands. It hides in books smuggled under coats, in classrooms built in basements, in scholars who refuse silence. Every act of learning is a rebellion against forgetting. And perhaps that is the real immortality of the library. Not that it once existed, but that it refuses not to. Walk today along the shore where it once stood. The sea is calm. The wind carries the scent of salt and dust. Somewhere beneath the water lie the stones of its foundations, marble blocks inscribed in languages no one alive can read. The tides wash over them endlessly. Yet the light that once burned there continues, passed from mind to mind, voice to voice. Humanity keeps lighting that torch, generation after generation. We cannot stop. It is who we are, the species that remembers. The Library of Alexandria was destroyed more than once, but it was never defeated. Its fire crossed empires, religions, and centuries. It burns in every book, every school, every archive, every search bar, every question that begins with how or why. It burns in you. And as long as someone, somewhere, refuses to stop asking, the fire will never die.